Well, thank you, Skip, for that nice introduction, and thank you to OCLC for having us here today. This is actually a pretty exciting moment for us. We've been, I'm going to talk a little bit about collaboration in general, what we're up to at the Chicago Public Library, but obviously the focus of this is really a unique collaboration that we started talking about over a year and a half ago, I guess closer to 2 years ago. But this is a really exciting moment because this is the first time that we've come together and actually talked about this collaboration to any audience or any group. So it really means this collaboration is moving forward, and I think that we're really excited about what it's going to bring to the field of libraries. So just as a bit of background, this for a library audience obviously is not new. This is some sort of trends that were put together a number of years ago on some of the societal shifts that are impacting our world, the changes in the number of jobs that people will have throughout their careers, the way that we're disseminating and absorbing information, this idea that we're going to, oh, look, my slides are going fast against me. This idea that we're going from a more local to a global context in terms of how we're operating as a society, and this idea that our institutions are moving away from being centered on ourselves and more focused on our audiences and being more directed by our audiences. And so as we think about that in the context of public libraries, many of us have been working on this idea for a number of years and thinking about how we can be more driven in terms, sorry, it's automatically moving forward, how we can be more driven to move away from one-dimensional content distribution to looking at how we can provide deeper, more meaningful access to our patrons, to our mission. The idea that we don't act independently as organizations or as libraries anymore, that we actually act as agents in our neighborhoods and in our communities. This idea of a public library in particular is being part of the ecosystem of our cities and of our communities, and that through those collaborations, through those partnerships, and through that deep integration, we're realizing our mission in a much more radical way than we did ever before. So this sort of link to the way the society is changing, the way that we are changing as a world, and the way that we're changing in libraries. As we've been thinking about this in Chicago, I'm just going to keep flipping my slides. I think it's on some sort of automatic forward, so bear with me. As we've been thinking about this in Chicago, one of the things that we really took to heart was looking at where we are right now as a city in terms of where our economy is as a city, where our education ecosystem is a city, where our strategy is in terms of supporting the future of our communities, particularly the future of our city through our neighborhoods. And as we've worked with the city and we've worked with our collaborators, we developed a strategy that actually sunsets next year that looks at our unique value proposition through the lens of our mission. So looking obviously at the value of our public library through providing equal and free access to information and ideas through traditional mechanisms like collections and technology and all the ways that we've done for us the last 145 years. But we also then looked at sort of the unique lens of the public library in the context of how we can support our education strategy, how we can support our neighborhood strengthening strategy as a city, and then how we can support the economic strategy of our city, and again, through the unique lens of our libraries. And as we started this process of looking at sort of the future of CPL in this context, what emerged is a number, I think, of really interesting opportunities about how we might collaborate in different ways, in deeper ways, with our neighborhoods, with our civic officials, with our partner institutions, and on a whole broad range of fronts. Now, some of these things may not seem radical to the audience here, but for us in Chicago, some of these ideas were new, and some of these opportunities, we think, are helping us, not only in the short term, but in the long term, drive deep and meaningful impact across our city, and again, using the unique mission of a public library. So what I want to talk about first is the way that we're doing this really around capital. And I think one of the big changes, if we think about where we've been in Chicago, if you know my sort of background, I started my career actually in Seattle at the Gates Foundation, and then soon thereafter began working at the Seattle Public Library. We passed a major bond to rebuild all of the libraries in the city. It was a roughly $200 million bond. And then from there, I went on to San Francisco, where we did something very similar. We passed a $200 million bond to renovate or build new most of the city's libraries, which was an extraordinary opportunity to get involved in design excellence and working through the ecosystem of the city and having one nice sort of chunk of money to distribute across the network. What we've done in Chicago is actually something quite different. That I remember when I came here, one of my big ideas for the mayor was, hey, how about we pass a bond to renovate all the city's libraries? It worked really well in San Francisco, worked really well in Seattle, and he's like, we have a $700 million structural deficit, meaning that we have borrowed against our future for years and years and years, and my job is to fix that. So passing a bond to borrow more money to fix our libraries is really not going to be on my agenda, so sorry, no. So if those of you who know Mayor Emanuel, he is a character, and he's very creative and also very persuasive, and also has big ideas. And so he didn't lose track of the idea that we needed to make an investment in our neighborhoods. It was more he redirected me and redirected our team to think about, is there a way we could make a similar kind of investment, but do it in a different way? Do it in a way that's financially responsible, do it in a way that's more deeply collaborative, and hopefully bringing to light a vision of investments in our neighborhoods. Now, this number actually needs to be updated. I just realized we're now at about $275 million in new investments in the Chicago Public Library's infrastructure, in capital as well as people, just over the last 7 years, which is a pretty extraordinary number given the fact that we haven't passed a bond and we've gone literally project by project by project to realize a vision. We're now, by the end of 2019, we'll have built 11 brand new libraries, so either replacing existing facilities in their current spot or building new completely on a new site for neighborhoods, and we'll have done 17 major gut renovations. We recently announced that we intend to also build a new or renovate a library on the west side that will be our third regional library, which isn't part of this because we have to sell a painting first. There's a little bit of controversy in the city right now. We've talked about that offline. And there is actually some more collaborations that are in the pipeline. So those of you who know Chicago politics, the mayor has decided not to run for re-election. And so really he's focused on his legacy. And I think one of the things that we're really excited about in Chicago is that Mayor Emanuel sees a big part of his 2 terms in office here in Chicago. A big part of his legacy is the work that he's done through public libraries. So we actually have some more announcements to come. But I think what's exciting to me on the capital front in Chicago is that we've achieved all this through radical collaboration across many different organizations and organization types, the way that we piece together from funding. I mean, one of the projects I'm going to talk about today, I think I lost track of the number of different sources of funding that we put together to create these projects. And so what this has meant, and again, I'll be honest, when we set out to do this, I was a little like, it'd be easier to pass a bond. If I have to, if I have to go like person by person and group by group and engage all these different folks, it's a lot of work. But one of the things I hadn't fully realized and anticipated is that at the end of this is that the forced collaboration, the forced conversations, the idea that we would actually bring along a network of people to see libraries as an important part of their agenda, important part of their mission, had this whole byproduct that we hadn't fully anticipated in our approach or strategy, which is much more deeper engagement, a bigger investment, a better understanding of the radical role that public libraries can play in shaping a city, in supporting the future of a city. And I think that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, actually, in terms of my tenure here in Chicago, is that through this work, we've actually brought a whole team of people along with us that are, in some cases, unlikely partners. So what I want to talk about, and this is actually not a new concept. Now, if you were to talk to Mayor Emanuel, he would say that we're the first library in the country to do a co-located library in school, and I keep reminding him that we're not the first public library in the country to do that. But what's exciting to me about this particular project, and this was the first project that we did, is that in the back of the Arts neighborhood, this is a neighborhood that is low resourced. There isn't a lot of city assets in this neighborhood. It's a strong neighborhood community. We had a neighborhood library here. It was a leased facility that we lost due to a flood. And right across the street from that library, we were opening a $100 million new high school campus. And so, brand new facilities for, recreation and, beautiful courts for, playing sports and all kinds of great. It's a focus on science and technology. And so we're sitting down and we're talking about the fact that we're building a $100 million campus across the street. The library had been closed for 2 years. There wasn't a piece of property the city owned, or that we didn't have, again, a capital budget to acquire land or to build. And so Mayor encouraged us to sit down and talk with the schools about, might there be a way that we could incorporate a library into this campus? And so turns out that there was, and they were about to break ground actually on the campus, and we completely shifted the project. And what we were able to do was integrate a 12,000 square foot neighborhood library into this campus. And to me, I think, even though it wasn't the first time that a public library has co-located with the school, what it signaled, I think, for us as an organization, what it signaled for us as a city, is that there's a way to collaborate in new ways. And so perhaps this was the first time that we've done this in Chicago, and it sent a new signal to the mayor, it sent a new signal to our elected officials, our city council, and again, if you're not from Chicago, we have a city council of 50, and each of those city council members is elected by their neighborhood, so we have a lot of different people to kind of keep happy, and all of those folks are really focused on their constituents. And so I think what was exciting to me about this particular project is that everything aligned for us to show that actually public libraries can work with a neighborhood-based organization, in this case a neighborhood school, to build something that is for the whole community as well, is for the actual collaborator, in this case the school. This led us to a larger conversation about our needs around the city, and actually I have to give a lot of credit to our mayor for this particular form of collaboration, is that we have about $300 million of capital right now that are going into public housing around the city of Chicago. And those are, again, our history around public housing. It's a little bit checkered in terms of how well we've integrated public housing. We're actually opening a National Public Housing Museum in Chicago to tell the story of public housing nationally. And a big part of that story is here in Chicago. And again, some of that history is really positive, and some of that history is not so positive. And so as we were thinking about, again, our needs around the city, actually the mayor came up with this idea. He's like, public housing has this thing called a community benefit, and that as you're building public housing, you actually have to create something that is for the broader community in theory. And so I think in reality, those community benefits hadn't really come to full fruition. And I'll be honest, we had done in San Francisco, we had done some co-locations with housing before. There was a senior housing project that we co-located with. There was a private residential condominium association that we co-located with. So the idea, again, of co-locating a library with housing wasn't a brand new idea, but I think what was exciting about this idea is that the mayor helped us realize that the money piece, the piece about how you actually pay for the library, could actually be paid for by the Chicago Housing Authority. And so it had never been done before. We had to go to Washington, D.C., talk with the national organization to free up or to get special permission to free up the housing dollars to actually fund this community benefit. And again, the mayor took the lead in this. And what this allowed us to do, and I'm going to get into the design excellence piece in a minute, what this allowed us to do is actually build 4 brand new libraries across the city of Chicago, one of which will open later this year, the other 3 will open first quarter of next year, with co-located libraries and housing. And again, what was exciting to us is an opportunity is that this wasn't us coming with, again, a big blank check or a big check saying to Chicago Housing, just give us a carved out box and we'll stick our library in there. It was essentially what we did in San Francisco and in Seattle. What this meant is that we had to roll up our sleeves with Chicago Housing and really look deeply at what is the mission of public housing? What is the mission of a public library? And I'll be honest, I about fell out of my chair when I actually looked for the first time at the Chicago Housing Authority's mission. And what I realized is that their mission was so closely aligned with ours. It actually didn't lead with housing as their mission. Their mission was really about rising all tides in neighborhoods and communities. Housing is an important stabilizer in how we bring together neighborhoods and communities. But if you actually read what their mission is about, it's actually much better aligned with libraries than I had ever imagined. And so what we had to do is start a conversation about how the mission of a library, how the mission of housing overlapped to build a business case for our friends in DC. And then we had to actually go through the process of taking those early ideas and figuring out how then do we design that into a concept that will work for both the residents of the housing, would work for the broader community surrounding the library. Of course, the public library is to serve the entire community. And then this additional element was, how can we do this in a way that brings or sends a signal to the neighborhood that the housing that we're bringing to this neighborhood, the library that we're bringing to this neighborhood, isn't sort of just a cookie cutter. It's something that is inspiring, something that is that's a great asset for the neighborhood and community. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, but it's really it led us to really thinking about what is our design excellence approach in Chicago. And for us, until recently, we just basically built the same library all over the city. And so this was, again, a big departure from where we'd been in terms of design excellence. So these are just a couple of snapshots of the libraries that we're building with public housing. We've actually changed this to the Little Italy branch library name. So this is the Roosevelt Library. This is Independence Park Library, which is on the north side of the city. This is also a northwestern side, the Northtown Library. And then finally, on the far south side, the Altguild Library. Now, the Altguild Library is it's a freestanding, standalone library, and it's adjacent to a larger public housing development in Altguild Gardens. And so, again, one of the things that has been so exciting about this kind of collaboration is what we figured out is that we can actually use housing dollars to pay for libraries. But we also figured out is that in order to do that, we had to have a deeper collaboration with housing, not just sort of slot ourselves into it. And it's really led to, I think, a historic collaboration for us in the city and an opportunity for us to do a whole lot more in terms of the programmatic side in our public libraries than what we really had imagined doing in these neighborhoods before. So then there's another kind of collaboration we've done, and this is a collaboration with private development. I'm going to talk about two, and the one I'm going to end on is really the primary one that we're here to talk about today. And this is, so this first one is actually, will be our 81st branch library, and the second one will be our 82nd branch library, so we currently have 80. This is the West Loop Library. So when you look at sort of the development that's been happening in our city is that there's certain neighborhoods that say didn't really exist in their, as residential neighborhoods even a decade ago. And one of those neighborhoods is actually the west side, or the west is called the West Loop. It's very centered to the city, but just to the west. And in this particular area, there was a meatpacking district. It was a very vibrant sort of working neighborhood, but not a residential neighborhood. Over the last 10 years, the meatpacking has gone away. These, beautiful old sort of loft-style buildings have been turned into residences, and so it's been growing really fast. So the fancy hotels are over there. There's a new Ace Hotel. They're, building, what's the name of that fancy club, John? The Soho House, yeah, John belongs to it. The Soho House, I don't belong to it. Soho House is over there, all the fancy restaurants. But you know what? The people in the neighborhood were like, this is growing, this is great, but where are our city assets like neighborhood libraries? And so one of the things that we did in the city is that we started talking with the developers who were building, doing all this development. And obviously this is a great thing for the city. It's also a great thing for their pocketbooks that they're getting to build new hotels and those kinds of things. And again, the neighborhood elected alderman, so the member of city council that represents this neighborhood, sat down with us and sat down with them, and we're like, hey, you guys are getting a lot of money. You're getting rich off of this sort of West Side development. What are we going to do for the neighborhood here? And we can help you in your process of continued development, and we would love to help you in your process of development if you help us get a library. And so what this allowed us to do essentially, and I'm sort of talking around this just a little bit, is essentially one of the developers said, you know what? How about we do this? How about we donate to you a 16,000 square foot building, one of the former Oprah Studio buildings, so part of a complex right across the street from the new global headquarters of McDonald's, which they were building at the time, just opened a few days. If you haven't been there, if you're visiting Chicago, go see Hamburger University. It's sort of the epicenter of McDonald's. Get these great little mints. But so right across the street was one of the remaining buildings of a former Oprah Studio building. And they said, why don't we donate this to you? And we're like, great, we would love to have this 16,000 square foot building. Oprah would take great care of it. And we're like, how about you donate to us, and then maybe you hire an architect and then build it to our specifications. How about that? I'm learning in Chicago, right? You have to ask. And they're like, we can help you find the architect. And so we had a back and forth, and eventually we got to yes. And this library will open next month in December. And what's exciting about this collaboration is that there's no cost to the city here, right? This is our 81st branch library. It's a brand new facility, gorgeous library, built to our specifications, a great community asset. And we worked with a developer who has a business reason to be in the neighborhood. And we helped them sort of understand how that business reason they're in the neighborhood, that building a library for us would be in service of their short and long-term goals. And again, this was, had we passed a bond, we would have just sort of bought a slot of land and built it up. And again, this was a way for us to engage more deeply in the business community, the larger community, the political ecosystem of the neighborhood, the neighbors who were actually raising their hands saying they needed a library. This was a way to really generate the interest around the library, so much so that we didn't have to pay for it. We do have to pay for the staff and the books and the technology, but everything else is for free. Now, this leads us to the last collaboration that I want to talk about. And I'm going to talk very quickly through some programmatic stuff and then hand it off to my partner. So almost 2 years ago, once the Obamas announced that they intended to build the Obama Presidential Center in Chicago, we wanted to start having conversations with them about how we could work with them like we do so many of the other great cultural institutions in our city. And I think that one of the big shifts in our strategy was to look at the network of 80 libraries that we have in the city as being an artery to bring the best of what Chicago has to where people are in their neighborhoods. And so there's lots of examples of how we've been doing that. Museum of Science and Industry is doing incredible science-based learning in our neighborhoods throughout the summers. We've done all these great programs. And so as the center was coming to town, we were, our sort of not very creative idea was like, how can we work with you guys to help extend your reach through our network of neighborhood libraries in the city, and then perhaps work with libraries beyond Chicago to extend your reach? And so we started these discussions, and Michael Stratmanis, actually, who was, I think, one of the very first people on the ground, we started showing him around to our libraries, talking about some of the work that we're doing with engagement of teens and digital media and stuff that we're doing with young kids. At some point along the way, Michael asked a really basic question. It's like, this is fantastic. The work that you're doing, we have this really progressive mission about what we're trying to do with the Presidential Center, and we want to send not only the right message about the openness that the center will be, because again, centers, and I know we're going to hear about this, tend to be a little bit more inwardly focused, but we wanted to send the right message about how we are here for the neighborhood, we're here for the city, we're here for the country, and we're here for the world. And there's this very hyper-local idea about a public library. Have you thought about maybe putting a public library in this center? And I'll be honest, we hadn't thought about that. And so we're like, oh, God, geez, that's a great idea. I wish we were that creative. And so we went back and we looked and we did a feasibility study. And actually, similar to the West Loop, this particular neighborhood doesn't have a library. There's been a lot of growth over time, and so it actually made a lot of sense for us to do it. And so we're like, yeah, we'd love to do that. How do we pay for it? How do we do it? And so we had about a year of conversation, and which led us to the announcement that we made just a few months ago, which we intend to embed a branch of the Chicago Public Library right in the heart of the center. And we've started the design process, the design meetings, but very similar to our discussions with the Chicago Housing Authority and the schools and the others. The conversation started with the unique value proposition of what public libraries can provide to our neighborhoods and communities. The way that public libraries can be an artery to bring the local community and the broader community. And again, what happened in those discussions is, like, rather than trying to replicate what we were already doing so well in public libraries, the center wisely said, why don't you come and do what you do best right here with us? And it's been a really extraordinary, the preliminary conversation really extraordinary, and where we are today, I think, is really exciting. And this will be the first time a Presidential Center has ever put a public library within it. There's a lot of firsts in this collaboration. And again, we haven't announced it yet, but we have found a funder that will actually pay for this element. So certainly, we're not paying for it as a city, and the center is going to be developing it with us. But again, we found somebody who was excited about what we're trying to do here and was ready to write a check for it. So that announcement will be coming down the road at some point. But again, the salient element of this is that I think that as we look at the game change of public libraries, that we have this incredible mission. We have this radical mission, in fact, in terms of how we can work with communities, with our local community and our broader community, how we can really shape the conversation around culture in our neighborhoods, how we can bring communities together around ideas, support the education system in our communities, workforce system, et cetera. This mission that we have has value. And in what we found in Chicago, valued to the tune of about $275 million in terms of investments that we haven't had to go out and ask city to raise the money for, but we've actually been able to find folks who believe enough in the mission of what public libraries can offer their communities and neighborhoods to actually make those investments on our behalf. And I think that's a really exciting note about what our future can hold and a way that we can start changing the conversation in our public library world. Got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to power through a couple of quick things. One just side note, we used to do what were called prototype libraries. And so again, part of this new approach that we're taking is actually building beautiful buildings and neighborhoods. And so rather than replicating the same neighborhood across each, because we're deeply invested in working with the neighborhoods on getting these libraries, we're also bringing them into the process of design and hiring sort of world-class architects. This is the Chinatown Branch Library, which was the first departure from our prototype that we just opened a few years ago. This is a 25,000 square foot children's library that we built in our Harold Washington library just a couple of years ago. These are the ones ones you just saw here. And these are all, the architects for these are world-class architects. And one of my favorites is SOM, Skidmore, Merrills, and Owings, and they have a huge corporate headquarters here in Chicago. They're building skyscrapers all over the world, but their crown jewel is actually this little Chinatown, or this little library in Chinatown. And if you go to their offices, like the model for that is like right in their lobby. They're so excited about the 16,000 square foot library they've done for us. So on the programmatic side, the kinds of things, and this is not going to be new for this audience, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but what we're doing in our libraries is not just about capital. What we're doing in our libraries is about community engagement and learning. And so there's a variety of programs that we've done over the years that reimagine. And one is actually, that we're really excited about, is the Summer Learning Challenge, the way that we're engaging kids in learning in the summer months. What's particularly impressive about this program is that with the redesign, what we were seeing is actual academic gains for kids as they're coming back from the school year. We're actually enrolling the kids in the program. We had 110,000 kids this summer, and those kids are coming back from summer actually seeing gains in both reading and math, 15% gains in reading and 20% gains in math and science. Our homework assistance program, very similar. All locations after school are providing free homework assistance. This program is also, we found, is actually driving real academic gains for our learners and actually reaching the hardest to reach kids in the city through this homework assistance program. A pretty well-known program in Chicago that we started back in 2009 will be now at 23 locations by the end of the year. UMedia, which is a digital media learning program for teenagers. And again, this program has really been redesigned or reimagined to be a post-secondary pathway for teenagers. And what we've actually found is that that's actually working, that we're connecting kids to new technologies and careers and industries that they wouldn't otherwise be connected to, and it's leading to opportunities for them beyond high school. And we're doing some really great stuff with adults and adult ed as well. Some of our work with our Cyber Navigator program, which is basically just digital tutoring, we reworked that program to make it more focused on workforce development. Last year, we saw roughly 1,000 people self-report that they got jobs through this program. So it kind of goes on and on and on and on for us. And I think that as we're looking at the role of public libraries in supporting neighborhoods and communities, there's also a piece that we have to, I think, take responsibility for and really focus on, which is how are we going to drive real, meaningful impact? And so as we've been focusing on Chicago, building visibility, building new libraries, building deeper collaborations, it's also meant that we've had to up our game in terms of the impact that we're driving on the ground. And we've also been doing that as well. There's a lot of other programs that we're working on. And I think that, again, in each of these cases, we're speaking the language of the workforce ecosystem in our city, and we're actually driving the kinds of impact that support that ecosystem. We're speaking the language of our education system in the city, and we're making the necessary changes in our program and program design and implementation to really drive educational impact in the city. And actually on the neighborhood strengthening front, there's a lot of exciting work that we're doing there, but I'll say as we're beginning our next strategy, our 2020 strategy, that's actually one of the areas that we're most excited about, and it's actually the area that we feel like that we have a lot of work to do in, is how do we begin demonstrating in really tangible, meaningful ways the strategic role that libraries are playing in driving real connected communities and stronger communities, safer communities, et cetera. And so we're looking forward to that being part of our next strategy in the future. So with that, thank you, and I know I'll be coming back at the end.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm going to really change the game here because I'm going to shift from a very specific focus on libraries to a very specific focus on the idea of the museum, and specifically the Museum of the Obama Presidential Center. And thank you to Brian for such a wonderful, energetic presentation. I'm going to kind of read at you, so bear with me as we work through this. So my presentation today shares conceptual thinking about the Museum of the Obama Presidential Center, the OPC, as a new model for an innovative social and cultural institution. As the first truly urban presidential museum, the work of the OPC is grounded in the power of place, the iconic presence of Chicago and the Black metropolis, and in the national and global stories that have shaped and continue to influence the work and life of Barack and Michelle Obama. While the museum will privilege the telling of a nuanced history and will foreground the power of objects to illuminate key aspects of the human experience, the central mission of civic engagement, of the relationship between individual agency and collective action, opens up a space for the visitor to investigate, curate, and forge their own connections between past and present. The Presidential Museum of the Future, therefore, throws into sharp relief key questions about museum making and the forging of a nonpartisan, creative commons that is at once flexible, participatory, inclusive, and inspirational. So building a museum, a presidential museum for the future. As the founding director of the Museum of the Obama Presidential Center, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk briefly about what it means to make a museum, what it means to construct a museum from the ground up, to envision and shape a living, breathing, social and cultural institution. I'll begin by providing a sense of the physical space that this museum will occupy. I'll consider the role of history and the importance of narrative as it shapes the museum's very reason for being, before turning to the idea of process, or the carefully calibrated work that goes into exhibition design and interpretive planning. And I'm interested broadly in the idea of social infrastructure, as well as the key theme here, which is radical collaboration, and really bringing museum and library together in dialogue. So the museum, projected to open to the public in 2022, is, of course, still in the early stages of design. And so while the thinking I will share today is schematic in scope and formative in regard to development, it provides the intellectual blueprint that will carry the project through to execution. In turning to my title, Why Building a Presidential Museum for the Future? Many people, and I think broadly of the everyday visitor, think naturally of museums, and especially presidential museums, as being tied to the past, the figure of the museum as a kind of quasi-mausoleum. And while it's critically important to tell the story of the nation's first African-American president, to tell the story of a remarkable individual, and of the grassroots movement and two-term administration that signaled an epochal shift in American politics, we also want to think about the relevance of this history itself going forward, how a deep-rootedness and understanding of the past and present carries us towards a sense of future possibility. Following the mission and vision of the Obama Foundation to elevate the critically important role of civic engagement, we want to ensure that the everyday visitor sees him or herself reflected back in this otherwise phenomenal story, and that younger generations, schools of future leaders, are in turn inspired and equipped to make time-sensitive, much-needed change in their communities. These are, I think, lofty and yet grounded ambitions. And so we seek to build a physical experience that offers a space for immersion, for storytelling, for dialogue, to provide the tools to understand how we can all engage with the vital issues that shape the world in which we live. So I turn now to the idea of space itself, and this is an image you just saw from Brian's presentation. Our goal then is to unpack the traditional model of the presidential library and to situate the museum as part of a dynamic center, the first truly urban presidential center situated in Jackson Park and deeply rooted on Chicago's South Side. And you can see here an early model of the center with the museum positioned as an iconic vertical structure. While we may refer to the center's buildings and landscape as a quote-unquote campus, we might think of it not as a place of encampment or enclosure, a barrier to people who don't feel like they belong, but as a civic or creative commons, where local Chicago residents and visitors, estimated at some 700,000 people a year from across the country and from around the world, will gather to share experiences and ideas, and to participate in the timely, ongoing work of collective action, which is to say, a nuanced understanding of the workings of democracy and what it means broadly to be an active participant of a country of the world. In this regard, the museum functions as the de facto anchor of the Obama Presidential Center. It is the most public-facing manifestation in physical terms of the ideals and mandates bound up in the Obama Foundation's core mission of civic engagement and the training of future leaders. And it will exist then as a platform not only for people already actively engaged in the public sphere, but in service to a general audience of all ages, some of whom may be coming to this history or this sense of connection and purpose for the first time. It's important to note that this new museum will also join a consortium of other institutions within the environs of what is referred to as Museum Campus South. Institutions such as the Museum of Science and Industry, which Brian mentioned, and the DeSable Museum of African American History. And we want to understand through ongoing dialogue with our colleagues, and certainly including the Chicago Public Library system, the sort of connections that might be forged between our respective platforms and programs. So the center is made up of 3 individual buildings connected below grade underground on what we call the garden level, where the green space of the center's landscape is extended into a series of smaller gardens, including enclosed winter gardens in keeping with Chicago's seasonal flux. Drawing upon the ideal of democratic space making, the 3 buildings embrace a central plaza, a space for welcome, for convening, a space enlivened by the presence of public art and by the programmed as well as impromptu performances that might take place there on any given day. And I'll say a little bit more about this space making in a moment, and especially in regard to the ideal of radical collaboration as we move to, Brian and I move towards conversation. So turning now to the idea of the power of place. The importance of this site and the significance of the Obama Foundation's work here can only be understood in relation to the broader history of what we call the Black metropolis. As a central hub of the Great Migration, a destination during the early decades of the 20th century for those de facto refugees fleeing the Jim Crow terror of the Mid-South, Chicago offered a place of respite, the promise of prosperity even in the face of continued segregation and great hardship. We might think of Chicago as a crucible for cultural formation, a sentiment echoed in the art of Archibald Motley, in the sharp-eyed naturalism of Richard Wright, in the poetic economy of Gwendolyn Brooks. The artist Theaster Gates, who works through his Rebuild Foundation to salvage, reclaim, and revitalize decaying or empty spaces on the South Side, states that beauty is a basic service. And so we need to think deeply about how to create a place of beauty within a space that is generally cast as one of nihilism and violent dispossession, of poverty and gun crime. And yet the South Side remains a place still of great creativity and great tenacity. The work of the museum, in synergy with the OPC as Civic Commons and with other civic-minded projects already on the ground, is to connect and to harness that energy and that potential, ensuring, as I noted earlier, that the history at the heart of placemaking always feels timely and relevant to its consumers. In this regard, we also think deeply in terms of interpretive planning about the role of the arts and the importance of cultural practice, or what we might refer to as praxis, the engagement, application, exercise, or practice of ideas. While science and technology sit at the cutting edge of human endeavor, we might consider the way in which art and artists push the boundaries and how we understand what it truly means to be human in a particular time and place. Art making is a primal force, a language we develop in many ways before speech. And so in the process of building a museum for the future, we seek to bring these voices to the table to help shape or forge the space of the center itself. In terms of a presidential connection, we might think about the way in which President and Mrs. Obama made a conscious decision to privilege the role of the arts at the White House. Rehanging collections, for example, on loan from the National Gallery, inviting artists, writers, painters, musicians, dancers, designers to enter the space as active collaborators on pressing social issues and to mentor youth in the act of giving back. You can see here how art-based programs will invigorate the otherwise insular corridors of a presidential history. The goal is always to build upon associations and to think expansively. While the museum, and here we're looking at museum visitor flow and connections. So while the museum will tell the story of the Obama administration, this didactic element is but one part of a holistic model, of a center that fosters connections between its component parts. This is what we refer to in the field of museum design as an interpretive master plan. The museum embodies the idea of a journey of ascension, hence the vertical circulation, of moving upward from the grassroots, from a sense of me to we. We consider the building as the metaphor of a vessel or a lantern, of a beacon on the landscape that seeks to inspire. This sense of individual agency is then conjoined through participatory programming in the democratic space of the forum. The forum will include a small auditorium, multi-purpose maker spaces or civic labs, along with discrete spaces for hands-on productivity, such as a recording studio and a test kitchen, the latter in keeping with the kitchen garden, also incorporated within the landscape, a legacy of the First Lady's White House garden and her initiatives on health and wellness. And then we see within this formation the possibility for that third space of interaction, a small branch of the Chicago Public Library, again unpacking that traditional model of the presidential library, as a space for knowledge formation and circulation accessible and open to all. Importantly, we want to think about how each of these amenities will best serve not only a range of visitors, national and international, but also South Side residents in a way that will ensure that the community, the local community, feel a sense of true ownership and participation. So turning now to the idea of storytelling. The power of storytelling resides at the heart of any museum. Yet storytelling is also a key element in the work of grassroots organizing, and it has been central to the work of President Obama, beginning with his community work on the South Side, but also as a writer and a thinker, as a storyteller par excellence in the finest tradition of American letters. It is storytelling that helps to make sense of the connection between individual agency, the story of self, and collective action, the means by which a vibrant democracy is lived and practiced. While the narrative arc of President and Mrs. Obama's story forms the spine of the museum, that primary arc is interwoven with a deep historical context. With the foundational narrative of African American and civil rights history, of the Black metropolis, of American progressive history, for example, the women's movement, gay rights, environmentalism, to name just a few, as well as those quote-unquote counter-narratives that serve to push and pull against the tenets of American progressive movements. It is this woven narrative, the museum's essential DNA, that makes up what we refer to as the interpretive framework that will guide the visitor experience. The dotted lines on the narrative arc indicate those formative narratives that make up our contemporary society, the points at which we might stretch back, for example, to the nation's founding documents, to the history of racialized slavery, to the trans-historical connections that might be forged between, say, Abraham Lincoln and the inauguration of the country's first African-American president. At the same time, we are cognizant of the need for timeliness, for a way to make sense of history in a very recent events moving forward. In this regard, the past must feel connected to the present and to the issues that, in many ways, continue to haunt us. How might we begin to track and monitor the history of voting rights, of mass incarceration, or the impact of nuclear non-proliferation? How might we engage visitors to best understand their role as social actors, to understand that history is always in the making, and that progress, however we might wish to define it, is never a simple linear march through time? So we turn now to the idea of a transformational presidency. In terms of making this history digestible, visitors of all ages should leave the museum with clearly defined takeaways about the high-level issues that shaped the Obama presidency, topics such as healthcare or climate change, and representative examples of foreign policy, for example, the Iran nuclear deal, the opening up of relations with Cuba, as well as those pivotal moments, high points and low, that continue to shape the president's legacy. And yet these topics should also be presented as teachable moments, wherein visitors can begin to understand the mechanics of how this seemingly impossible thing called governance actually works. In that regard, the seemingly removed and rarefied world of international diplomacy becomes a set of strategic questions that an individual might apply to a town hall debate, to the exercise of participatory budgeting, to negotiations with an uncooperative landlord. Such scenarios are legion and expansive. Most importantly, the visitor must see herself reflected back in the telling of this presidential narrative, in the otherwise remarkable yet quintessentially American story, a story that in many regards could only emerge out of Chicago. In the realm of storytelling, there is much to be said for the power of the museum as a multi-dimensional experience. While we must acknowledge the role of the digital in everyday life, there is something instantly engaging about real artifacts and the role they play in enlivening a narrative and its historical context. So while the NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration archives of the Obama Presidential Library will be housed off-site, and while the unclassified paper documents will indeed be digitized to provide wide-ranging access to individuals all over the world, the museum as a collecting institution must still take seriously the primary role of stewardship, of preserving and sharing these unique papers and objects in perpetuity for generations to come. You can see here a range of materials that will be on display: manuscripts, correspondence, books, textiles, ephemera such as campaign memorabilia, and symbolic items such as one of President Obama's signing pens, all of which provide a sense of texture and authenticity to the museum experience. Physical objects, drawing from the interwoven, nuanced historical narrative, will be supported in innovative ways by documentary images, various types of audiovisual properties, and immersive experiences such as virtual and augmented reality that will bring people and places to life in emotionally engaging ways. And importantly, we want to think about all of the community-related assets that we might thread throughout this narrative. The images, stories, sounds, voices, particularly the importance of oral history that make up the power of place. So thinking about before, during, and after a visit to the Obama Presidential Center. The goal is to run programs before the physical building opens, whether that's collaborating with other museums and libraries on temporary exhibitions, or establishing a series of community design workshops as part of the museum-making process. But once the Obama Presidential Center opens, it will be the destination and the physical place where visitors will encounter programs such as docent-led tours, hands-on interactives, and other activities, for example, facilitator-led workshops on key topics represented in the museum. And we can think also about film series, talks, symposia, etc. Importantly, the center will also house a special exhibitions gallery, which will represent a roster of exhibitions relating to key topics tied to the foundation's mission. And this will be one of the main vehicles for bringing people back for repeat visits to the center, and that also in tandem with many repeat visits to the branch of the Chicago Public Library. And so while the center will be a destination in a revitalized urban park, it's encompassed in various ways by the idea of the digital domain, an ecosystem of web and mobile technologies that will help people to connect to the work of the Obama Foundation before their visit, that will shape and document their physical experience of the museum during an on-site visit, and which will help them to reconnect in new ways to the Foundation's ever-expansive networks of individual leaders, organizations, and projects. The goal is to help people to connect to others, often across ideological divides, in a way that promotes a sense of empathy or rational compassion, as well as meaningful impact on the public sphere. And so it should be noted that President Obama was the first truly digital president who harnessed the then still nascent powers of the internet and all of its capabilities. We might recall that the smartphone was still in its infancy in 2008, to revolutionize the democratic process of a presidential campaign. At the same time, the digital domain may live independently from the physical experience of a site visit, so that people who may never have the opportunity to visit in person can still connect to the museum's core narrative and act upon the work of the foundation and the center at large. And I should also note that the museum, and again in relationship to the library, reminds us of the importance of fact-based research, of how knowledge is produced and circulated. New technologies similarly play an important role in terms of communication and pedagogy, but in regard specifically to the museum, we want to ensure that it's also a place for contemplation, where visitors can really commune with the objects that tell these stories, that they can be enriched and moved by the art that surrounds them. So I'm going to move very briefly to the idea of process, and again, just to provide a window into what it means to build a museum from the ground up, and Brian spoke to the idea of design excellence. So museum making is a highly collaborative and interdisciplinary endeavor. It draws upon the work, in this instance, of the architects, Todd Williams and Billy Chen, and their team at TWBTA. It draws upon an exhibition design team, Ralph Applebaum Associates, known most recently for their work on the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the last museum to open on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., as well as a host of content specialists. And so we've been in deep engagement and conversation with members of the Obama administration, White House staff, and other key personnel, including historians of the period and scholars or other experts with deep knowledge of the subjects that will form the core history of the museum. Building and shaping a museum from the ground up is directly tied to the design of the project. A museum, after all, is not an office building. Its function is to deliver to a diverse public a physical experience that is both meaningful and memorable. Form and content should speak to each other, and more than that, they need to really sing on key and in harmony. Museums are, of course, physical experiences, and textual history must be rendered in three-dimensional space. In terms of interpretive planning for such a project, the exhibition design team draws across a range of disciplines: content developers who help to craft and structure the written narrative and its sense of flow, 3D designers who work alongside the architects to shape the physical space of the exhibition galleries, 2D designers who work with graphic assets, with typography and color palettes to create a carefully modulated environment, and digital and media consultants who ensure that the story is projected in a way that captures the spirit and the emotion of this particular presidential period. And this now turns to the idea of collaboration, and I think to radical collaboration. So as a project, we wanted to take to heart the idea of placemaking and to engage with a group of practitioners on the ground in Chicago, several of whom have close ties to the South Side. Importantly, as architects, designers, and artists, these team members are also pedagogues whose practice is informed by their teaching. Our goal is to look for ways to engage local residents and especially student populations in the very act and process of design, to solicit their input and ideas through a series of workshops, design charrettes, where ideas are sketched out as part of an iterative process, and prototyping, where design and program ideas are mocked up and tested. And so I'll close by saying that the kind of yes we can ethos is really the ideal behind this particular project. And I'm really interested in thinking through the ways that we're left not only with the lessons of history, but with the power and possibility to inspire people to make real change. And I think this is where the work of the museum and the public library then come together. So I'd be very happy now to turn over to conversation with my colleague, Brian Bannon, about this particular project. Thank you.
Should we move the torso? Nicely done.
Oh, thank you, and likewise. I wondered if we wanted just to kind of dig into a couple of aspects about this particular project, and then we'll have the opportunity to open up to the audience. And I was really interested in this idea of design excellence. We're still in the formative stages of kind of planning spaces, but I wonder what you've learned in terms of working with world-class architects about shaping libraries that has a real impact on visitorship. Again, to go back to Theaster Gates' idea of beauty as a basic service, and you were referencing these beautiful spaces, and we saw these amazing images, the SOM model at the Chinatown branch. And so I wonder if you could just speak through, as a librarian, your kind of the learnings that you've taken.
Yeah, that's That's a great question. I think that what's been exciting for us in the design excellence piece is that on the one hand, if you're familiar with the prototype approach, what we've done in Chicago historically for schools, libraries, parks facilities, firehouses, basically any civic building is get a strong Chicago-based architect, design the building once, and then that's sort of the building for the next 10 to 20 years. And so you can actually see the different eras of CPL 145 history as you kind of work your way through. So there's a certain efficiency or stated efficiency in that. I think that what we've been able to demonstrate with the Design Excellence program of essentially finding a new architect, doing a competitive process is that the motivation of a team coming to the table, especially when they've been selected, let's use SOM as an example, is really high to perform and to push the envelope on what the building can achieve for the neighborhood and the community. And so I think that in some ways, the early conversations, for example, with SOM, in terms of once we select them as architects, there was a lot of onboarding them with libraries. We had to spend more time engaging with the architects in helping them understand the mission of the library, the functional building program, what we had to achieve through our mission in the library. So there was more time involved in that. But the upside is that they spent the same amount of time trying to translate for us and actually, frankly, push us to think in new creative ways about how we might be able to perform that mission in this sort of unique footprint. And I think that, to me, that's part of why a Design Excellence program is so important, is that you have fresh thinkers that are coming to the table. They may not have worked with libraries. In this case, SOM hadn't really done a public library before. They'd done a lot of education spaces and those kinds of things. And so there is a piece where you really have to invest in the collaboration, but what comes out on the other side, from the functional side as well as actually the beauty side, I think can be extraordinary. And I think in the case of Chinatown, there's a number of things that SOM did on the just the basic functional library side that really push our thinking about what we can do in terms of a neighborhood library. But they helped us engage the community in new ways. We brought in a feng shui expert to look at even the entrances of the building and how we designed up in terms of like flow of energy through the space. The building is an oval, and so there's the idea is the energy sort of stays within the confines of it. So there was really some conceptual things that were really interesting. They also did some things. We had a really limited budget. So again, this is a firm that's used to building, skyscrapers in all over the world, and we had this tiny little budget for a neighborhood library. And so as we were going through value engineering and really basic things, they came up with really creative ways for the heating and cooling systems in the building, and ways that we can actually achieve what we had to achieve, but find new ways of doing it. And so I think at the end, the community was more involved, the library got pushed as part of the process, and the final product moved us forward in terms of our vision for what we can do through neighborhood libraries. And each of these projects along the way, so we worked with SOM, and Ronan is one of the architects we're working with now, Koo & Associates was another big firm. So each time, this process is sort of roughly the same. And actually, I think as we're beginning to work with you into thinking about, I think this is what we're really excited around with the collaboration with the OPC, is that this is a new team. So your team, the broader stakeholders, and your architectural team will begin, we've already started the process of like, what do we need to achieve in this little neighborhood library in terms of program, but then how can we achieve this in new ways? What are the functional elements? How do we sort of push those discussions? We put together a team of Chicago library staff that are, a combination of folks who've been at the design table for all of our projects to, the frontline children's librarians that are just doing really innovative programming to help us think it through. To put that question back at you, in a sense, you've been, in the design space for a long time. You've been working in the museum space. When you think about this collaboration, and particularly even just working with a public library, so where were your cautions when you first, when you were coming to the table, like, oh God, we're working with a public library? Because, what were your cautions? And actually, where do you see your opportunities? And when I say that about cautions, one of the things that I think is important to note is that we're really the only we're the only public entity that will be on the site. So the National Archives is not going to be located on the site. And so there was a big intention to keep the institution one that really is completely private. And then there was a shift, which is we're going to be private, but we're going to have a public library in the center. So what were your sort of early cautions? And then also, what are some of the things that you're excited about in terms of this co-location?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's a great question. As you're aware, the conversation began before I actually came on board at the foundation, so I was kind of inheriting the fact that the branch of the Chicago Public Library was going to be part of the center. To me, I have to say it was incredibly exciting. First of all, because I have wonderful colleagues at the foundation who had made that decision. You mentioned Mike Stroutmanis, who's our Chief of Public Engagement. But I was actually coming from a public library to the foundation. And my curatorial background, I'm an academic by training and then had moved into a curatorial space. My training was at the Beinecke Library at Yale and at Gordon Bunshaft for SOM building. And then I had moved into museum design work on the content development side, working very specifically on the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and then had returned in terms of my own kind of career trajectory back to the world of the archive and to special collections. And so I was director of exhibitions at the New York Public Library for the research libraries as part of the NYPL system. And have just always loved the idea, even though I'd previously been in a university special collections, to the power and possibility of public libraries. And to an institution like NYPL, which I think is mirrored very much in an institution like CPL, just the great civic work that libraries do within these incredibly cosmopolitan spaces. And so the relationship between libraries and cities. And so I think for the foundation, there was a sense of caution around the idea of ownership of space, but then engaging with a municipal, so to speak, city-based entity and what that would mean. But the possibility, the energy behind the idea far outweighed any reticence around the pairing of those two kind of structural differences. And so, again, I spoke a little bit earlier about unpacking this idea of a presidential library, which is to say that the foundation is working very actively to ensure that the largest possible space is given over to the public. So the traditional model of a presidential library museum is that there is a museum, but then there is also the archive where the presidential library, the papers are housed. But a relatively small number of scholars use that reading room in a large footprint of an archive across any given year. And so we wanted to think about how, reflecting back on the ethos of the Obama administration, first digital president, to ensure that the records, the unclassified records, would be as widely accessible as possible, ensuring because they are NARA has the custodians of that collection, and so would house them in their own facilities, still ensuring that they're preserved and accessible to scholars, that we could then really create this vibrant, fully public space in a revitalized park. And again, Chicago has this wonderful model, as you know, of placing museums in parks. And so I think it's thinking about the connection between those three things, the museum, the public library, the public park, and really thinking about democratic space making. And so I'm really interested, I'm intrigued around the idea of collaboration through a kind of co-curation, of thinking about how this particular branch of the Chicago Public Library will offer the services that you generally offer to local residents, but the way in which we could also really potentially highlight the idea of civic engagement, connecting back to the work of President Obama, making connections between the museum's narrative and the kinds of circulating collections in the library, and then connecting the two through the forum, right? Opening up those programming spaces to you and your mission. Yeah. So it's a real dialogue. I think there is the potential, incredible potential for that synergy. Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, one of the things that was most exciting to me in the prospect of the center coming to Chicago is the ability for our public libraries in Chicago to help extend the reach of the center across the city. And then I think, again, we have a library community in the audience, is that I do think that, Bill Gates was a great example of that, as was Carnegie, is that the mission of a public library extends beyond all of us. Like whether we're leading or working within them or whether we're members in a community. And I think that one of the things I'm really curious about in the long stretch is how might we leverage the unique assets of public libraries in Chicago, in the United States, and around the world to help extend the reach of the OPC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I do imagine that new technologies will play a role in that. And I know you're thinking about kind of benchmarking other models, whether in the US or in Europe, that are doing really new and innovative things with library space and access. And so I think we have that kind of work to do, which is really exciting.
Including making it available during non-traditional hours. Rolf is over here. Where's Rolf? Rolf has had some libraries in Denmark that are available after hours that aren't traditionally staffed, which is one of those ideas that we're looking to borrow for this center as well. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting manifestation, and I think the day that we open will look probably very different 5, 10, 20 years out as we curate. Do we want to open it up?
Yeah, absolutely. And if someone could help us manage the time, thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Thanks for the inspiring presentation, particularly about space and how it's used to create public good. I'm wondering if you've thought about environmental impact in these designs and how that plays into the vision potentially.
I can touch on that a little bit. I'm certainly not the expert on issues of sustainability. We certainly have people on staff at the foundation who can speak to that issue robustly. But yes, environmental concerns, again, we're reflecting back on the Obama ethos, the importance to President Obama of environmental issues during his administration. And so really thinking about the way in which the building will speak to all of the greenest possible standards, whether that's LEED Platinum designation or other approaches. But then thinking again about the relationship between the building, its surroundings, revitalizing Jackson Park, kind of reintroducing biodiversity and support for the environment very physically, very literally, very locally in that space. But the architects, Todd Williams, Billy Chen, certainly again to go back to Brian's point about selecting world-class architects who are really cognizant of space and of materiality, of ensuring that the building will feel seamless and connected to the landscape. There are green roofs, for example. The buildings work seamlessly within the park. And there is a nice modulation between the iconic structure of the museum tower and then the arrangement of the buildings around it. There's also another building, which is the Program Activity and Athletic Center, which is also on the park. There will be children's playgrounds. There will be areas for events. There'll be a sledding hill, the kitchen garden I mentioned. So there's definitely very careful design thinking around environment and sustainability. And I would also connect that to inclusive design and the importance of the fullest possible accessibility for all visitors, regardless of physical or behavioral capabilities. So we certainly keep that in mind as well. And if there's anything to add, Brian.
Yeah, I think for us at CPL, we obviously use the LEED standard as a mechanism. But in getting back again to the design excellence, is that if you're working with a new architect every time, with the prototype, sort of you kind of had your approach with LEED for that building and all the others. And when you're looking at a unique siting, you're looking at the site, the light, whether you can actually do geothermal. So there's all these other elements that you can look at in terms of how you achieve the greatest efficiency of the building. You didn't ask this question but I'm going to turn it into this. One of the other things that I think has been really exciting about Chicago, and actually, frankly, to look at the leadership of the OPC, is not just the way that we're working on the environmental front, it's also the way that we're working on the community front, that we have really progressive rules related to local hire and MBE, WBE, so minority-owned business, women-owned businesses, to people in the neighborhood and in the community actually getting to work on the projects. And we as a city have worked really hard to incentivize those opportunities, and it's been really fun to see and inspiring to see the commitment the OPC has made to really engaging the local community and the broader Chicago community and actually getting to work on this project as part of the values and part of the mission.
Hi, I ride past the Chinatown branch every day, and it seems like the footprint of the building was anticipated the Wells-Wentworth connector infrastructure project. So I'm wondering, are there any infrastructure projects or any sort of anticipatory concerns with the Obama Center that you have to work through?
So just, yes, so if those of you who are familiar with Chicago, the Chinatown Library was actually on a triangular lot, and we acquired the lot and the adjacent lots with the intention of realigning one of the major thoroughfares, Wentworth, that would actually formally connect old and new Chinatown. And so we're right sort of at the center of that, and so the design of the building anticipates that realignment of the street. That's very minor compared to a lot of the logistics that you're having to think about with the center. So do you want to talk about some of the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, I'll touch on this very briefly, but in terms of creating a cohesive space within the footprint of Jackson Park, and again, this will be 19 acres of a much larger space, is to ensure that there is connectivity. So that means closing one particular road and widening another one. But at the end of the day, the idea is, again, to bring back a cohesive sense of the park and the parkland. And that space is currently very difficult for local residents to physically traverse the space and to fully access the park and the lagoon, for example. So that work, very infrastructural work, is actually part of the larger mission of connectivity and connecting back very literally to community and to ensuring that community can feel fully engaged.
Good morning. I'm wondering, on the subject of collaboration, if there's been any conversation with city colleges of Chicago, and if there hasn't been any recent conversation, what do you think such a collaboration would look like, given city college's long history, I think 100 years plus of educating Chicagoans?
So maybe, want me to start with that one? Sure. So yes, the short of it is yes. I think there's lots of opportunities with city colleges in Chicago. So for those of you who are less familiar with city college's history, is that in not too recent history, we had probably the lowest graduation rates of any city college in the country. And we the city led a major redesign, reconceiving the approach that we do to with City College, and moved away from sort of just general enrichment courses to actually looking at our city colleges as being an important pipeline to the larger business ecosystem of the city. And so we created a series of specialized colleges around the city, so in the healthcare space, in the digital manufacturing space, and a variety of others that really looked at how do we educate the next leaders in these different sectors that are going to drive our local and regional economy, and not necessarily needing to do this with an AA, but sometimes through just certificate programs, et cetera. So for us at CPL, we're actually been watching it very closely, and it's a great question, because actually I was just talking with Phyllis, who was one of the speakers here yesterday. We had lunch following about this very thing, and one of the opportunities that we see with city colleges is actually linked to a pilot we started just a few years ago at Chicago Public Library, which is now we're spread it all over the city, and there's many libraries around the country that are doing it. It's a very simple concept called learning circles, and it's a collaboration with peer-to-peer university. What they've done is they've taken high-quality online learning courses, so massive online courses, which completion rates historically around 3%, and so people starting these courses and completing them, and that 3% are completing them are typically people who have advanced degrees, and they're like, what if we could get people to complete these courses and actually link them to something, beyond sort of just personal enrichment. So we started a couple years ago with them, and we started advertising just basic classes like Python programming, public speaking, mathematics, et cetera, in neighborhood libraries just with paper flyers. We had people signing up for these courses and never learning online before and completing these courses. And so our first round of pilots, we had a 60% completion rate for classes like Python programming. And so now what we're doing is it's a really simple idea. It's a 6-week course. People raise their hand to do it. They come and it's almost like a book club, but they meet more regularly, like 6 times over the course of a short period. And what we think, back to the City College questions, is that this type of coursework that public libraries can do, and again, there's libraries now all over the country that are doing this, they can be a meaningful link to our City College ecosystem. So if we, for example, do a series of online courses related to cybersecurity, let's say, cybersecurity happens to be one of the big focuses of City Colleges. There's a specific certificate program. You can do it in, like, I think 8 months, and then get, fast track into a job paying $80,000 a year. So I think our big question is, how can these small sprint courses that we do in libraries that are sort of socializing people to content areas, how can they be a more direct on-ramp to our City College system? And so we're in the beginning stages of thinking about that as a possible collaboration. But there's many other ways that we can work with City Colleges as well as our traditional K-12 system in the city, but I think that's one.
Dr. Bernard, concerning the museum and the Presidential Center, I read recently that a judge has given permission for a lawsuit to go forward. Can you speak to that and what it might mean for the continued, progress of it, or the denial of building in Jackson Park?
Yes, certainly. I would say that we at the Obama Foundation don't recognize merit in this particular lawsuit, but at the same time, we take it very seriously. The foundation is actually not part of the litigation. The suit was brought to the city, but we're supporting whatever is needed in terms of moving things forward. At the same time, we continue with our work apace, that we are optimistic that the benefits far outweigh the questions that have been raised around the project. And so this is a project, just to go back to the collaboration that we have with the Chicago Public Library, which is about the common good. It's about revitalization of a location in the city, which the kind of revitalization which is much needed. And so we want to ensure that we're continuing with very forward-thinking programming, thinking through all of the possibilities of collaboration, really thinking about the good that can be done on the ground. And so that remains our mission in terms of moving things forward.
Hello, Dr. Bernard. Thank you so much for your presentation today. I wanted to ask a question regarding academic libraries. Will there be collaborations between the OPC and academic libraries in the area to engage college-age students?
Yes, we're still in the early days of kind of envisioning the programming, but again, to Brian's point around city colleges, the emphasis is on collaboration and connecting young people to the work of the museum, the foundation, and its programs. And so I think there is lots of potential there, thinking about the consortium of research institutions around the city, and certainly not just on the south side. I mean, I think one thing we do want to ensure is that we reach various populations in Chicago broadly, as opposed to only located in one specific place. And we do want to ensure that there is inbuilt training. We think, again, around issues of diversity, equity, inclusion in the museum field itself, and this perhaps speaks also to the field of libraries in terms of job opportunities. And so really thinking about how we can engage not only the K through 12 population, but students in higher education and from a range of institutions. So that's certainly something we will look to do.
So I wanted to ask about the way you're approaching the OPC is very different than any other presidential library. So, I mean, you have the social justice component, the civic engagement. So how has that different approach jibe with NARA and the way they have traditionally worked with these presidential museums and libraries?
I would say that there are certainly similarities as well as differences. So as I mentioned, the Museum of the Obama Presidential Center is closely aligned with the mission of the foundation, which is to inspire, to equip, and to connect people, young people, people of all ages, to make change in their communities. And so that's one of the driving missions of the foundation and therefore of the museum as part of the center. The emphasis is certainly on the museum experience, and I think that when the general public visits presidential libraries, they're actually visiting the museum, the presidential museum. And so that experience will be the same, that you will go to this museum, you'll come to this museum, and you will learn about the story of the Obama administration. At the same time, we do take seriously the importance of scholarly research in the Obama Presidential Library archives. NARA remains the custodian of those records, and so is committed to preserving and to ensuring that they're accessible to the public, to scholars. So I think it's a combination of those two things, the best of all possible worlds, and certainly a new, non-traditional but forward-thinking model to have the museum, the emphasis on objects, the importance of those objects in the telling of that history, to have access to the records digitally so that anyone can access them. And we can think about how that can be actually a program of the Chicago Public Library. And then for NARA to continue its important work to the nation, which is to ensure that the records are preserved in perpetuity. So I think it's a really vibrant concept but also speaks to the work of other presidential libraries and museums, that it is in tandem, in conversation with that traditional model.
I have a really basic question
Sure.
for you. It took us a while to figure out the nuance, but I suspect that some people in the room may wonder this too. What's the difference between the Obama Foundation and the Obama Presidential Center?
It's a good question. We think of the foundation as being kind of the overarching organization, of which the center is a core program, a core component of the foundation's work. The foundation is up and running. It's doing its work in terms of programming, both locally and nationally, through the program teams. But the OPC will be that physical destination and a housing of the programs for the future. So it will have a physical place. And again, it's reflecting back on the story of the Obamas, that the history of the first African-American president could only be made possible through Chicago. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of the Obamas giving back to the place where Mrs. Obama was born, where President Obama kind of found his footing and began his career. And so in the work of civic engagement, the meaningfulness of having a very physical place here in Chicago. But the foundation's work is broad-reaching. It's local, it's national, it's international. Does that answer the question?
I think it does.
Okay.
Hi, as a community college librarian, a Chicagoan, and a docent myself at the Field Museum, I'm really excited about the OPC coming. And there's just a little program that's always had a museum and a library connection. CPL has had family passes to the museum that can be checked out so they can visit our field campuses. And I'm hoping that the OPC will be one of those museums that will be folded into that pass so that affordability and accessibility will continue, at least for those families that can't afford it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a wonderful idea and something that we're certainly working towards.
I just had a question about what opportunities do you see with the CPL branch at the OPC to do things differently, or to think, it sounds like you're already thinking progressively with the Design Excellence Initiative, and really looking at, looking internally at collections, at, your slides were a little bit shifting in the beginning, as you mentioned, but I appreciated the segment that I was able to see on like 20th century library versus 21st century libraries. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how that, those concepts fit into these branches, these newer branches, and specifically a branch in the OPC?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that the constraint that we have, which is actually a great constraint, is that it's the actual footprint of the Chicago Public Library on the center is roughly 5,000 square feet, so that's a relatively small neighborhood library for us. But the value proposition and really what we're working through in terms of ultimately in terms of our design process with the OPC, and then ultimately our memorandum of understanding is that how do we best program that 5,000 square foot library for library services and to support OPC activities. And so this is library services plus OPC activities. And then in addition to that, how do we also program for example, the forum or other aspects of the center? And I think that this sort of constraint of a small footprint is in the collaboration is forcing us to really look at how can we take our two missions and see them overlaid. How does the OPC mission spill into the actual walls of the footprint of the Chicago Public Library, and how does the mission of the public library actually spill into the walls of what's considered the OPC campus? And I think one of the things that we're talking, there's going to be an incredible performance hall, and one of our U Media alums, or our digital media alums, is Chance the Rapper. He did actually his first mixtape at the Harold Washington Library, and he's so passionate about it. He comes back about once a month and does an open mic night just for teens at the Harold Washington Library. So for us, we're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could get Chance, who has a great relationship with OPC? I think they did. He's done a number of your events. Like,
yeah.
what if we host the open mic night in the in the performance hall of the OPC? And what a cool opportunity that would be for the neighborhood kids around the city to get to have access to the center in that way. And so those are the kinds that we're talking about. Certainly we can do a small story hour within the walls of the 5,000 square foot library, but what does it mean to be able to bring a group of kids for our weekly story hour into the forum, into another space within the OPC where parents and families get exposure to the OPC while also getting exposure to a library program? What are the things that we can do with our kids with a world-class museum, like literally, stone's throw away across the plaza from the library? And so we're in the very early stages of talking about that. And I think that, the value for us is that we're now embedded into a broader ecosystem, a broader community. And so rather than seeing it as just the strict walls of the Chicago Public Library, which historically, that's kind of how libraries have operated, is like, this is us and this is you, we're now integrating ourselves. And the process of integration is complicated, and it requires deep discussion and making sure that that it's working. But I think that similar to some of the collaboration talked about before, that if you spend the time really thinking it through, the value on the other side can often be much greater than just sort of occupying a very specific footprint or wall. So that's what, to me, frankly, what I'm excited about. And I think that what that will mean for us as we look forward, not just with the OPC, but as we look forward across our work across the city, is how does that influence our strategy moving forward as an organization? How does that influence our other collaborations in the city? We've had a lot of conversations even around the Harold Washington Library, which is our central library. It's almost 1 million square feet. We've thought about the possibility, that library has a visitor count of about 1.4 million people come through that library on an annual basis, which is similarly Art Institute, but there's areas of it that are not well utilized. So might we actually invite in other not-for-profits and others to come in? And so we think this collaboration with OPC will really help us unpack some of those questions, not only for our collaboration with OPC, but our collaboration with other partners across the city.
The first thing I want to do is just give a shout out for the hometown here, because we've just been through a Michelle and Barack Obama presentation, and we've been stayed and flatlined, and I got to give it up for this project. I don't want to wait for the ribbon company cutting to show my joy. So libraries are these repositories of narratives, and this presentation is part of the narrative of the creation, formation, building. It's really a very significant opportunity that the human design elements are threads of a continuing narrative that moved the whole country, whether you're on that side of the aisle or the other aisle, because this was an administration that wasn't going to go forward having divorced their own narrative. And I have such deep respect for a building project in the name of libraries as a repository of narratives that uses narratives to bring the project forward. I also want to echo questions about accessibility and income and opportunities. I'm a New Yorker, and I know that in various communities, when there's been a building created, that the people of the community who are not accustomed to getting something that is truly spectacular and elegant and amazing and has tremendous design features have a gap to come into and say, this is ours and it belongs to us. And it's so important that that message is always there, that this is for everybody in Chicago and for everybody everywhere, but to not rest at we're trying, but to say we don't open the door until that's resolved. And I want to lend my support for that to be inseparable from the scheduling and the cutting and the ribboning and the rest of it, because the minute it's an afterthought, we lose the very people who make the most of the opportunity to be there all along.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really wonderful reflections. And I'll just kind of re-emphasize the importance of storytelling and broadly a connection to literacy, whether that is literacy in its traditional sense or new forms of literacy, visual literacy, for example, and really thinking about the work that the museum in relationship to a library can do. And we think about that not only in terms of the importance of narrative to grassroots community organizing, but also the figure of the first African American president who is himself a reader, writer, thinker. Mm-hmm. You know, what does that mean symbolically for this country and for an understanding of democracy as a lived practice, connected deeply to the written word and to the power of words. And so we want to really embrace that defining example and to bring it to young people, and thinking as well about the role of the public library and where, again, in the early stages of defining the space, but thinking about the place of a small kind of special collections reading room, which would place an emphasis on, for example, first editions, manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts. President Obama has a very clear hand. It's really wonderful to see all of the drafting, the importance of his speech writing team, that engagement, that dialogue around crafting a narrative, which would be connected not only to speaking to his constituents, but also speaking to the world as a statesman of placing America on a world stage in a new way. And so I'm always been moved by seeing students engaging with original documents and the kind of power that those documents then connote. So there's a real connection around President Obama as a writer and connecting that to the work of the library and connecting it back to the work of the museum. So there's lots of possibility there, I think. But yes, also to emphasize the idea of accessibility and to go back to a point that Brian made earlier, the work of the public engagement team at the Obama Foundation is deeply rooted in community. There's much that we learn from community, and that learning comes from listening to what people want, to what people need. We also have a really wonderful group of advisors that we call the Storytelling Council. And one of those members, Anna DeVere Smith, many people will know of her work as a performance artist, as a writer, speaks to the idea of radical hospitality. What does it mean to welcome people, to ensure that they feel agents in the practice and process of creating this space? So it's not something that we're simply bestowing upon them as an amenity, but it's something that they really feel a part of, that they can take ownership of. And so I think all of those ideas connect through the idea of agency in literacy embedded in the power of the word.